So my question, Allison, is I know that in the study you gave verbal feedback to people.
Yeah.
Can you say a bit more about this? Because I couldn't find anywhere where you described what you actually said.
Yeah, so I've been asked about this a lot. So the reason I gave verbal feedback rather than hands-on, because hands-on would be another variable that could be argued that it wasn't controllable. Because as you know, when you're working on people, you put your hands in different places depending on what you register and what you need to do. So I had like a script. So was I didn't really go into much detail because
That's my next question. Just wait with that.
yeah. So yeah, you're probably going to ask me why I didn't include the Alexander technique specifically in the project. So I can answer that bit first in a way, because it sort of explains the next bit, is
Sure.
that the whole point about this project is I wanted it firstly to be something that anybody could read without having any experience of the Alexander technique. And given that often as soon as people hear the word Alexander technique, they switch off and go, oh yeah, I know about that, because they've had some experience of it, or they know somebody who had a lesson, or they read an article, or maybe they're a medic who thinks, oh yeah, that's that alternative thing that people do, or they're an instrumental teacher who thinks, oh yeah, I don't need to do that, I teach my students all they need to know. So I didn't want anything that would switch people off reading the study before they'd even seen what it was. And I didn't want there to be any jargon in there that meant that somebody who didn't know anything about the Alexander technique couldn't understand, because that's one of my gripes with a lot of writing on the Alexander technique. It's full of jargon that isn't explained. And as you know, as a scientist, if you're going to write any piece of jargon, you're duty bound to explain it before, you know, along with it. You can't just use a scientific or jargon term and expect people to know. So I wanted it to be a proper, you know, I have trained properly as a scientist, and so I did it on that basis. So I didn't have the discussion with the participants about the Alexander technique. I think they knew I was an Alexander teacher. I think I really can't remember all the details of what I said to the individuals, but I think they obviously, a lot of them knew I was an Alexander teacher. But what I did was, when I was behind a computer quite a lot of the time, so they were doing their playing related tasks, which, you know, involved just standing normally, through raising the arms as if they were going to play, through picking up and holding the violin, through to some extended playing. And through watching them, I'd already worked out what they were doing. And we didn't show them the model. I mean, the model was in real time as well. So I could see not only them, but I could see what was going on the model, which was quite interesting. But we didn't show them that unless they wanted to after the experiment was finished. And some of them were like, oh my God, is that what I was doing? You know, they're really quite shocked at what they were seeing. So what I did is I gave them a bit of feedback on what I was seeing in terms of what they did. And because I kind of knew what they were going to do, I was able to say things like, I've noticed that when you pick up the violin, you pull your shoulder forward and up towards the violin, towards the back of the violin, and you pull your head forwards and down. And we know that that's not a brilliant way to play. So I would say something along those lines, and I'd just explain why it wasn't great. I mean, it is in the literature, the performing arts medicine literature. There's a huge number of references about that particular way of playing. It gets in the way of your playing for a start, regardless of any pain or injury. You know, if you're tightening, obviously you're not going to be able to play, because if you're pulling the shoulder up, that leads to you pulling the elbow under to get your hand into the right position. That's going to lead to you stiffening your elbow and your shoulder, and ultimately your hand. So that's going to affect your facility. So I kind of explain a little bit of that to them, and maybe what they were doing in terms of standing. And then I would just tell them how to, or show them and tell them how to stand up better, or to how to stand in a slightly different way. And then how to take their violin from a neutral playing position, where they literally just had their hands, their violin in one hand and the bow in the other. And I was showing them how to pick up the violin without doing what they were doing. So I have a way that I developed with students that was based on how I'd worked out how I was going to do it in the end, which is basically sending up the scroll of the violin and maybe turning it and putting it on your shoulder with one hand, and then turning the head in a different way. So raising the gaze, turning the head to the left and allowing the gaze to fall so that the head comes onto the chin rest. And that's what you use to hold the weight of the violin. Now, with a lot of them, that meant that immediately it was obvious that their chin and shoulder rest combination wasn't right. But I left that out of it because, again, that's another variable that if we tried to control for that, it would be a nightmare. Because that's the bit in my individual lessons when I'm really trying to help somebody who wants help with the violin. That's what I spend quite a lot of time doing. We're taking different chin rests on and off and trying to get them to hold it differently and all the rest of it. So it was like a script that I had, so that it was pretty much the same. It wasn't absolutely identical with every person, but it was the same thing I was getting them to do. So that, yeah, you said that you didn't see the wording, so I have got that written down as like an appendix.
Right. So I see that Joan wants to ask something. I'm dying, but I can wait. It's okay.
It doesn't have to be a long answer, but I'm curious what happened to people physically when they were asked to play something with emotion, something that they liked. In my experience, when I'm playing with emotion, I feel physically great, because it feels like everything is connected. But I'm sure I'm probably doing something physically that's not good.
Yeah. Well, I think that is, I mean, that's the ultimate conundrum, really, isn't it, with the Alexander technique, is that ultimately you want to be able to play with as good use as you possibly can, whatever you're playing. And because playing something with emotion, I mean, the reason we got people to play something, a piece of their own choice with emotion, is because the very thing that you're saying, you know, when you're playing, a lot of the stuff that you've been working on goes out of the window, because playing something tricky demands all your attention. You know, if you're trying to play, I don't know, I can't play Paganini Caprices. I've learned and performed one a long time ago. But, you know, if you're trying to play something difficult, or Bach, I've done quite a lot of Bach. If you're trying to play that, it takes a lot of attention. And so sometimes, well, quite a lot of the time, you can't necessarily put into practice absolutely everything that you've done through the Alexander technique. So the reason we got them to do that, really, is because when you are playing like that, you're just playing and you're not necessarily thinking about all the things that you're doing. And at that stage of the experiment, they didn't know anyway. They didn't really know what the game was. They didn't know what I was going to ask them. They didn't know what they were doing, and they didn't know what I was going to ask them to do with the interventions, as it were. So I think when you for myself, me playing the violin with really good use is a work in progress, and it'll probably be work in progress until the day I can't play anymore, you know, because I'm too old and decrepit. And I think it's got to be the case for everybody who plays a musical instrument, is that you're constantly learning and constantly honing your skills. So yes, you probably do play in a way that's not as good mechanically as you do when you're really thinking about it, playing your scales when you're first warming up, or whatever it is that you're doing. But that's kind of normal. And I think the more you work at it, and the more time you spend setting yourself up each time. So when I'm practicing, what I'm always trying to do is come back to like neutral, and you know, set myself up again in a good way. The more you work on that, and the more you become aware of what it is that you're doing, the more you can bring that into your everyday playing. But I find it really hard, because it is hard. You know, it's like a tennis player or a sports person trying to change some aspect of their technique, they have to work on it a lot as well. You know, it's a mind game as much as anything, that when they're under pressure, they don't play as well as when they're not under pressure. And it's the same for us. So I think it's just one of those things that who's perfect. You know, you're never going to be perfect at it, but what you can do is just get better and better and better, so that when you're playing with emotion, you can still have a conscious element of your playing that's still paying attention to what you're doing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think what I guess when I was younger, I could access the meaning of the music and wanted to communicate it. And I'm not sure I was even in my body. I was in the music.
Yeah.
So that to me is the ideal.
Yeah.
However, I'll never be able to do it without being conscious of my body. I mean, I still can. So I guess it's a kind of a meta cognition question, because to me, playing well and, you know, playing Paganini and doing all the technique is not why I play.
No, I know.
It's to communicate from the deepest part of me. So yeah, so for me, the physical is a step towards the whole, I guess, in my playing. So yeah.
But I think there's also, it's like there's a realization that people have that they're going to have to think about this all the time. I certainly had that. It's like, oh my God, am I going to have to think about how I play my violin all the time? And the answer was yes. And that is mind-blowing, because that's not what you want to be doing. But in a way, if you go back to, and I'm not saying I don't do it, you know, I find it very difficult to think when I'm playing, when I'm like yesterday, I had a concert with my chamber music ensemble. And in that moment, when I'm trying to play the first violin part of Beethoven's Storm Quintet, it is very difficult to pay attention to everything that I'm doing. My attention is focused on making sure I make all the right repeats and I play as in tune as I can, and all the rest of it. But I have spent hours practicing, trying to be conscious of what I'm doing. So not just putting my hand somewhere, but knowing where, actually consciously knowing where it's going. I think the thing about, the question that people often ask is that, oh, well, I want to, you're saying I have to think about it all the time. What you mean? I don't get rid of all my old bad habits and build up new ones. And the answer is, if you go back to your habitual way of doing stuff and you become not conscious of what you're doing, then how do you know whether it's good or not? And that's really what your question is. You're saying that when you're playing, when you're really in the moment of playing and in the music, then it's hard to remain conscious. Therefore, you don't really know what you're doing physically. But I think that's just normal. And all we can do is continue to strive to be as conscious as we can. Because if we're as conscious as well in the music making as we are in our practice, in our technical practice or in our practice of our use, the way that we set ourselves up in playing, if we can be conscious when we're playing the music, then surely we'll actually convey the music better as well. If we really know what we want to do, if we're aware of all the crescendos, diminuendos, the nuances that we want to bring to it, then surely that's a good thing. Because I mean, I don't know about you, but when I learn a piece and when I practice it, I don't just play it with any, I mean, in orchestra, I play it as best I can, but when I have time to spend on learning a piece of music and playing it to perform, I think about what fingering is best, what bowing is best, what string I'm going to play it on, and all those things. And that's all part of the process of being conscious in performance. So I just think that being conscious of yourself physically is just an extension of that. And just as is being conscious of what you're thinking, because we know that what we're thinking affects what goes on with us physically. So when we go on stage and perform, nobody makes us be nervous, nobody makes us tense. That's our reaction to having somebody listening, and it need only be one person, but suddenly we're under more pressure. And so if we can be more conscious in that moment of performing, then that also helps us deal with what we're what we're thinking. So the big one for me when I perform is that my mind goes off onto other things, because that's part of the, the response that we have when we're under pressure. I'm thinking, oh yeah, that bit went well, or yeah, but actually what I'm always doing is going, no, pay attention. Yeah, you've got that bit coming up. I'm always trying to bring myself back into the present, because my tendency to drift off when I'm performing is much greater because of the stimulus of having people listening, and the fact that it's an old habit. Nerves is an old habit that we learn at some point, usually when we're teenagers, and somebody says, oh, are you feeling nervous? You think, no, I'm fine. And then you spend the next 40 years trying to overcome what you've learned. So sorry, that wasn't a short answer at all, Jen. I'll shut up now.